Hello, this is Gary Hoffman with another video in the Tarvin Family Association video series. Today we're going to talk about understanding the Tarvin numbering system. If you like these videos, click on the like button and subscribe. Also, you can share with your friends and make comments in the comment section below the video. That tells us that you like the video and that you might have some ideas about how we're doing on our video series. Let's go back to the beginnings of Tarvin genealogy. Richard Johnston Tarvin created this family tree in 1897 to illustrate how the Tarvins in northern Kentucky and southern Ohio were related. The trunk of the tree is Reverend George Tarvin and his wife Sarah Craycroft. Children are represented as branches off the trunk and grandchildren as twigs, and off those twigs, great-grandchildren are leaves. Now, there are no dates, so no indication of the birth orders of these children, but this was, as a beautiful piece of art, was obviously the beginnings of how we understand the Tarvin family in Kentucky. Now, many names were repeated over the generations, especially George and Richard, so in order to differentiate amongst the various members of the family, we needed some kind of system. Well, Tarvin research evolved from there, and by the 1970s and 80s, there were several people digging into their history in the Tarvin family. Sarah Thompson Tarvin wrote many letters to relatives and eventually found the researchers and began a round-robin letter to communicate amongst the researchers. Sarah set a goal to publish a book of Tarvin descendants of Reverend George Tarvin and Sarah Craycroft. By the 1990s, computers began to be a key genealogy research and publishing tool, and the drive was on to identify the birth order of Reverend George's children so we could figure out a system of keeping track of them. And a way to keep track of these descendants was definitely needed. So here's how we represent the Tarvin tree today, more of a descendancy chart, with the 13 children, and now we've identified their birth years, so we can now see what order they were born in. These numbers represent the birth order of the children, and they also are the Tarvin line numbers that we often talk about when we ask, what line are you? Well, these children also had their families. Every one of them had some children, and we needed a system of keeping track of these children as well. So let's zero in on Thomas Tarvin and see how we do that. Thomas Tarvin married Deborah Flora, and they had 12 children on these years. So we can take the birth order and create a new number for each child by separating the parent's number with a dot or a period, and then the number of the child. The birth order then determines the next ordinal number. So let's see how that algorithm works. For every given descendant of Reverend George Tarvin, you take the Tarvin number of the parent, append a dot, and then append the birth order number of the child. The Tarvin number then tells how each descendant is related back to Reverend George Tarvin. Now, this system has a name, and I looked up in Richard Pence's work about numbering systems in computer genealogy, and it turns out that the system that we're using here is called a D'Aubeville system. Now, it's related to the Henry numbering system that's used quite a bit, but the Henry system does not use separators like our dot, so they have to use letters if the family has more than 9 children, as many of the Tarvin families did. So we prefer to separate the generations with a dot to help us keep track of the many children in the family. So where do we use these numbers? Well, we've got them in the published books. The line 1, 3, 7, 10, 12 books have been published, and they all use these Tarvin numbers. We also use them on the Tarvin Online Genealogy database, and I will show you some examples. But we don't use them when we deal with trees in Ancestry.com or in Family Search, because those are places that other people have access to and can see our families, and they may have a whole different relationship to our family than we do. So we generally do not use Tarvin numbers when corresponding with cousins or in casual conversations. But if you compare Tarvin numbers between two people in the family, you can determine how you're related to each other and to your ancestor, George Tarvin. Let me give you an example. From the Line 1 book, page 288, we have Davy Tarvin, whose wife had 11 children by him. And we can see here that his number 1.5.5.6 is continued through the children, where we add another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 for the 11 children. In the Tarvin Online Genealogy database, here's that same family. Here's Davy, and here are the children, and you see how their numbers are listed here. In the database, we use the title field, which is available because we don't have too many titled Tarvins. That's another reason why we don't export these numbers to other databases, where they expect a title of nobility rather than some number. Well, this is a nice and tidy system, right? Pretty simple. Uh-oh, not so fast. Let's see what happens, because many Tarvins married relatives in their own line or another line. So how do we handle the complex situation where children could have two numbers, one from their father and one from their mother? Well, arbitrarily, we've decided we choose the father's number then to append the children's birth order number. Otherwise, we would be tracking many, many numbers for branches of the family where there were several marriages. Here's a cousin example from line 3. Lala Rook White married Taylor Barker Moore, and they were both Tarvins in line 3. Well, we take Taylor's number and put it on the children and count the 5 children with that number. Let's go back a generation or two to the origins of line 1 and 3, when Rebecca C. Tarvin, who's the daughter of Thomas Tarvin and Deborah Flora, here she is, married John Cowgill Tarvin, probably pronounced Coggle. And arbitrarily then we take the father's number, because these were first cousins. We take the Tarvins, the father's number, and I don't have room to show you all of the 12 children, but here's where we apply the number to the children. Now, cousin marriages are quite common, especially in the 1800s, and especially in areas with a high concentration of family members like northern Kentucky and other places where we have small, close-knit communities. But we only track the Tarvin cousins when we're talking about marriages. And it turns out many marriages were also between cousins from the collateral lines, from the other parent line. We do show overlap amongst most of the Tarvin lines. You know, the farther back you drive your genealogy, the more intersecting lines you will find in your own genealogy. This is called endogamy or pedigree collapse, where cousins of various degrees marry, because after all, we're all cousins. So, you know, in a small community, who are you going to marry anyway? Well, it turns out that the author of the Tarvin tree, Richard Johnson Tarvin, married a cousin. His wife, Mary Emma Wiley, was from line 1. Now, she died. Oh, that means that they were second cousins once removed. She died in 1888, which was about 9 years before he made that tree. Let's take a look at the tree. Here is Richard way over here on the line 4 branch, Richard Tarvin line. And over here in line 1, Mary's mother Verenda is shown because she is a granddaughter of Reverend George Tarvin. So we can't show Mary, that is, Richard didn't show Mary on the tree, but we can add a little leaf on Verenda's leaf to show how Richard and Mary were related. Well, that's all well and good for Reverend George Tarvin's line, but what about the William lines? Well, we can track descendants of Reverend George Tarvin the way we just did, but we can also use the same numbering system for the other Tarvin groups. We just have a different starting place for Reddick, Churchwell, William II, William J, and others. It does help to show the relationship both vertically to the ancestor and horizontally to the cousins. Here's an example of the children of Reddick Tarvin, and you see we've created a root number of R, and his first child is R.1, William F. Tarvin, and we go down to R.12. Now, this is internal to the Tarvin Family Association, but it's a way of keeping track of which branch, of which sub-branch, and which twig and leaf these family members belong to. Here's another way of looking at Reddick Tarvin's line. In the descendant view in the Tarvin Online Genealogy Database, you see in the descendancy here from Harriet E. Huffman, his wife, these 12 children are listed with their R. numbers in this view. Now, there's one more thing, and that is adoptions. Now, we do assign a Tarvin number to somebody who descends from a Tarvin either by blood or adoption. But it turns out early adoptions were informal and not actually registered with a state agency. So many adoptions or foster situations were not close enough to require or to actually say that that child was descended from that Tarvin family. Sometimes a Tarvin remarries and then assumes responsibility for their spouse's children, and in some cases, then we'll give those children a Tarvin number. But often, adoptions are sensitive, and we only figure out these relationships after key persons are dead. So we follow the rule of thumb. We try to include where possible, where it makes sense, and where people feel an affinity to the Tarvin family. So now that you understand the Tarvin numbers, let's see how we can use them. You can look up your own number in the Tarvin Online Genealogy Database and see your relationship to your Tarvin cousins, because we have in the database something called the relationship tool. So let me give you an example of that. By logging into www.tarvinfamily.org and see your relationship to your Tarvin cousins. So I'm going to use the example of myself at www.tarvinfamily.org/genealogy, and I look myself up here, and you see my Tarvin number along with my name in my profile. But there's a little tab here called Relationship, and Relationship helps us to calculate a chart with somebody else who's in the same tree. So I'm going to show you my relationship to Dave Tribby. Dave is working very hard on line 11, and I want to see how we're related. So I put Dave's name in here, I look him up, and here he is. And then I press the calculate button, boink. And after a moment or two, the Tarvin Online Genealogy Database gives us this beautiful chart here. Well, as you can see, it goes back to Reverend George, which is our root ancestor, our common ancestor between Dave and me. And you can see my picture down here in the lower left and Dave's picture down here on the lower right. Let me show you what this chart represents. These people on the first line are siblings. George Tarvin 10 is the son of Reverend George, and Sarah Tarvin, 11, is his younger sister. And then as we go down the list, these are the first cousins, the second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, and fifth cousins. But we still haven't reached me because I'm removed by one generation. So we have to figure out that Dave and I are fifth cousins once removed. Well, I think you'll like it if you will try it. The Tarvin numbers help us keep track of our ancestry and see how we're related. So today we talked about the Tarvin numbering system on this Tarvin Family Association video series. Please press like to tell YouTube that you like this video and you want more like this. Please click subscribe so you'll get notified about them. Click share to send this to a relative, and then of course leave a comment. Let us know if you like this. Also, any suggestions you have for this video or for another one. So until next time, I'm Gary Hoffman. Thanks.